So, our webinar topic for November is all about understanding cultural differences. And that's what we're going to dig into a bit more today and explore this topic together. So, excited to chat with you all about this. For those of you who've been here before and have been through our workshops or webinars, you know who we are and who I am. But for those of you who need a refresher or who haven't been on in a while, or maybe this is your first time, my name is Felicia. I'm one of the co-founders of Inclusion Geeks, formerly known as She Geeks Out. Our mission is to design a future of work that works for everyone. My lovely co-founder Rachel is also on the line today, so if you have any tech issues on the back end or any questions while I'm facilitating, feel free to ping Rachel and she'll be able to help you on the back end. A little bit about me, I'm based out in Western Massachusetts in the US. I'm married to a donut maker, I'm a cat parent, and I geek out about a lot of things, including local government and ghosts and true crime and all sorts of fun stuff. But that is unfortunately not what we're here to talk about today. But I do want to quickly mention that, as I just shared earlier, I am in Western Massachusetts on the traditional lands of the Nipmuc, Pocumtuck, and Nonotuck peoples. And I'm going to share a link in the chat, which is a wonderful resource. Some of you may have seen this before and maybe you use it all the time. Others of you, maybe this is a new one, but this is a website called nativeland.ca. And it's a really great website to explore your location because as I'm looking through the chat, we have folks coming in from all over the country and maybe even outside of the US as well. So take a moment and chat through or look through that whenever you have a chance. All right, so here's what we have coming up. Before we get into the content, I want to share a little bit about what we have in store for you all for the rest of this year and starting our year off strong in 2026. So there's a QR code on the screen. Feel free to go ahead and grab that link now if you'd like. It takes you to our event page on our website. So if you don't have the ability to grab that, you can always just go directly to our homepage, which I'm sure Rachel will share in the chat at some point. But we have one more public workshop coming up in December, which is all about reimagining the future of work together. I'm personally really excited about this one because it's going to be a bit of what we love to do here at Inclusion Geeks, which is pairing education with action. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the research and data around what the workplace looks like right now, in a much broader sense than we're going to be even doing today in this webinar. But then we're also going to be spending quite a bit of time in terms of thinking through what could the workplace look like in the future and doing that kind of work together. So that should be a really fun, really creative workshop. And so I encourage you to check that out if you are interested at all. And then in January, I'm running a workshop, which is also a public workshop around how to facilitate. Basically, think of it as facilitation 101. So if you like what I do as far as facilitating and you'd like to learn a little bit more, definitely consider signing up for that. I'll be teaching you all my tips and tricks that I've learned over, gosh, I don't even know, 10 plus years of doing this work at this point. So that's a little bit of what we have coming up in store for us. And again, if you've been to any of our webinars in the past, you know that I always like to name the heritage months that we are in. So we are in November. I cannot believe it has already come to this point. This year has been a long year, but it's also flown by. And November is National Native American Heritage Month, also known as American Indian and Alaska Native Heritage Month. This particular recognition honors Native communities and their cultures and their traditions, and it also serves to help raise some awareness around the unique historical and present day struggles of Indigenous peoples here in the US. Now, again, I want to name that I'm based in the US, our company is based in the US, and so we talk about things like this through a Western centric, US centric lens. If you're coming in from a different part of the world or different countries, you may have different ways of recognizing this. But that's again why that website I shared earlier is such a wonderful resource because no matter where you're located, you can go ahead and take a look at your particular location. Really quick background to this particular month here in the US. It was designated as National Native American Heritage Month in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. So it's a relatively more recent heritage month, if you will. And I want to just name that American Indians and Alaska Natives make up about 2% of our total population here in the US, which is about approximately 6.9 million in 2019, which was the most recent number I found for that. The states that tend to have higher populations of Indigenous peoples here in the US are Arizona, California, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, North Carolina, and Alaska in that order, which might be interesting to you. It was for me. I also want to really quickly name that there was recently just devastating typhoon that happened earlier this month in Alaska that wiped out entire villages. It received very little to almost no media coverage or attention, but the devastation was massive and just beyond, anything that we can imagine. I'm going to share a couple links in the chat in case you're interested in learning more. And if you can spare, of course, as always, feel free to consider donating as well. I also want to note that there is so much that is happening in our world, especially here in the US right now, that just doesn't get covered. And so this is just one example. There's a lot of other stuff out there too. So actually, if you know something similar that you feel should have recognition or attention right now, definitely feel free to pop that in the chat so we can all know about these things together. So, that being said, let's talk a little bit about how we can engage together during this webinar for our topic at hand today. And so, as always, the chat is a great place to communicate with us and ask questions. We'll have some time for dedicated Q&A towards the end of the session, as always. There will be a Slido poll or two, so if you have your devices handy from that previous slide with our workshop links, definitely hang on to that. We'll be having a Slido poll come pretty quickly. There will be Q&A, as I mentioned, and then we do have closed captions available. So if that's helpful for you, feel free to go ahead and turn those on. If you don't need it or if it's distracting, you should have the ability on your end to turn those off. Again, for anyone who's new to this work and to me as a facilitator, really quickly, from my own personal background, I've been doing this work for a long time with my wonderful partner, as I mentioned. And on a personal note, I'm biracial and I'm also disabled. So I really love the closed captions because it's helpful for me. But again, not everyone needs them or uses them. But if that's helpful for you, then glad to have that and glad to have you here. All right, so let's dive into our topic for today. We're going to start by discussing culture and cultural diversity just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I want to start with the definition, which is going to be what is culture? And we're going to define culture. Now, this is my favorite thing to say when I do these kinds of webinars. I have definitions and I have a lot of ideas, but I would love to know if any of you have definitions or if you have thoughts that you'd like to put into the chat before I go ahead and share my definition. So if you have any thoughts around what is culture or how you might want to think about defining culture, or even if you have like a keyword or two that's popping into your head right now as you're thinking about culture, put that in the chat and let us know because I want to get a sense of where you all are before I share my definition. And I'm one person, and so my definition is one way of thinking about it, but we might be thinking about are we going to co-create a definition of culture together? So I'll give you like maybe 30 seconds in case anyone is furiously typing on the back end because it's a little hard to know when we're meeting like this in a virtual sense. And I see at least one person's come through, which is wonderful. So we see culture is a version of myself that I bring into each conversation. Oh, I love that, Anushka. A version of yourself. And I think that's part of what we'll talk about today is how do we come up with that version of ourselves and where does that come from and how does that get created and defined? All right. Let me know if anyone else has any other thoughts. But what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and share. Oh, I see one more thought coming through. Perfect. Oh, actually, a couple more thoughts. Wonderful. All right, let's see what we got here. It's coming through fast and furious now. All right, we see. I like to think of culture as the unspoken and sometimes rarely spoken norms shared in an environment. I love that bringing into the conversation around what are the norms that we're discussing and that we're living with. All right, we've also got for the workplace an amalgam of communication, leadership, engagement, recognition, DEI, policies, procedures. Yep, tying in that workplace element to it. And we're going to talk about workplace for sure, because that's the unifying factor that brings us all together here, of course. And there's also other ways to think about culture too. So thanks for bringing that in, Stephanie. All right, Fatima, you said culture includes everyone. I love that too. All right, love that. Keep it coming if you're typing on the back end. I'll keep an eye on the chat. But here's how I'm defining culture. Culture is a concept that permeates our lives and influences how we perceive the world around us. It's a really powerful force that shapes our behaviors, our beliefs, and our interactions with each other. It refers to how we live with each other, everything that's learned, shared, transmitted from one generation to another. One of the main points I always like to hit on when I talk about culture is that it's not static. Culture is ever evolving. It morphs and shifts and changes as it should. And if you ever think, especially if we're talking about workplace culture as something that is fixed, that for me is always like a little light bulb moment to take a pause and kind of think a little bit broader and think to myself, okay, is that actually the case, or am I looking at this through a very sort of narrow lens? So it encompasses lots of things like our language, the values, the norms, the rules, the beliefs, all the different things that we're creating. This is all part of our culture. And I will say that this definition is from diversity consciousness, and I really enjoy this definition a lot. So that's why I've shared that with you all today. What I'd love to know before I move on to workplace culture specifically is, do you agree with this definition or not? If you agree with it, put a plus in the chat. If you're like, okay, Felicia, I'm not entirely sure about this, maybe put a dash in the chat, or even feel free to share some thoughts. And you can also use emojis. I love the emojis too. So definitely feel free to let me know. I'm always curious just because, like I said before, I'm one person coming into this conversation, but culture involves a lot of people, not just one person. All right. So we got some thumbs up coming through. Wonderful. Let's go into workplace culture. So when I think about our culture at work, we might define it as shared values, belief systems, attitudes, a set of assumptions that people in a specific workplace share. Because when we come together at work, we're bringing all of our personal cultural beliefs, the values, how we are, the ways of being into that workspace, and who we are influences our workplace culture. And honestly, sometimes it's vice versa too. Sometimes our workplace culture influences our personal values and how we show up. Again, want to know if you agree or disagree with me here. Also, do you have any examples of workplace culture that are maybe coming to mind right now? Because for me, sometimes what comes up a lot is just, how I feel. Again, what are those norms? How we're showing up together, and even things like what's accepted, what's not accepted, what are the sort of like stories that maybe permeate work. I don't know about you, but I feel like a lot of us had been present in jobs where you join a new organization and you hear sort of the lore that happened maybe before you got there. That's part of culture too. And maybe there's new lore that happens that you're part of, right? So all of that kind of goes into workplace culture. Now, let's kind of go one step further and talk a little bit about cultural diversity. Because cultural diversity is all about bringing people together from a diverse set of backgrounds, cultures, and experiences. It also can refer to how are we creating these environments that not only recognize the differences that are present, but also celebrate them. And I see in the chat we got a couple more comments. So someone's asking, what's a cultural difference versus a personal difference being in the US for a UK team? Yes, that's definitely can get complicated. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Stephanie. And Fatima, you said sometimes the goal to strive for rather than actually achieving. Yes, because again, like a lot of times, none of this stuff, well, I shouldn't say none of this stuff. Sometimes a lot of these topics and concepts that we're dealing with, like culture, they're really big and they're really broad. And we won't ever necessarily know if we like did it, right? And really, to your point, Fatima, I think the idea is that we probably will never achieve something. We're always striving towards it. I talk a lot about this kind of work in general as a marathon, not a race. But my favorite thing to say, which Rachel's probably thinking through already and laughing to herself, is that the marathon never finishes. We're always just continually putting the sort of the end posts further and further away. And we never actually get there. We just keep going through it, which, for some of us can feel like a lot, but I think that just represents the work is ongoing and it never ends. It just changes and looks a little bit different. All right, so going back to cultural diversity, let's talk a little bit more about this now. Now, this is a model that I love to use. I know I've used it many times this year in our webinar, so some of you may be very familiar with this already, either through us or through other aspects of your work or seeing this in other places. But if you've seen this before, put a plus or a one in the chat if you remember it or if you've seen this. If this is new to you, put a dash in the chat and just let me know. This model I really like. It's based off of a couple different other models that are out there, but I want to really focus on the cultural level for today. So really quickly, because I do see there's a few of you who haven't seen this before, this model kind of helps us understand how diversity can show up in different aspects and different layers, if you will. So this is you right here. So this is what you like, what you dislike, if you like Brussels sprouts or not, whatever, all the things that make you you, your values, your beliefs. And this tends to get shaped pretty early in life, but it can change over time. And then we've got these other layers that kind of pop out here. So we've got primary, secondary, organizational, and cultural. Primary elements or aspects of culture are really core dimensions of what makes you you. So these are um, things that tend to be pretty inherent to us. So not always, but things like what is your first language? How old are you, right? Like those are really core to who we are. Secondary layers are still important differences, but they tend to be acquired usually a little later in life. Maybe they don't have quite as much influence in defining who we are. They also can tend to shift over time. So, are we a parent or a caregiver or not? What is our education status? What do we look like? Those are examples of secondary layer elements. And then in the organizational layer, that's where we really see that like that workplace stuff. So that's where, aspects of culture that are typically found at work. But what I want to talk about for today is the cultural layer, because that's what we're talking about. And so these are really more cultural dimensions that influence who we are and how we show up. I'll name a couple of these here because sometimes people don't always know what all these differences mean. So, for example, let's see, we've got being or doing. Sometimes that one's a little bit confusing for folks if you're not familiar with this model. So cultures that are more in like a doing mode tend to emphasize work and achievement, and cultures that are more in being mode tend to prioritize relationships, social connections and interactions, and being more present in the moment. So that's kind of what we mean when I say being or doing. Different cultures have different conflict resolution preferences, and that tends to oftentimes be rooted in whether the culture is more individualistic or more collectivistic. There's a lot of other elements too. One of my favorite ones to also mention is the idea of time. Different cultures perceive time differently. Here in the US and in the Western Hemisphere, we tend to sort of default to thinking about time in a very linear fashion. But if we were to look at the Swahili people in East Africa, for example, they perceive time as events happening. And so if you're thinking through what the sort of the distant future could be, for them it's virtually non-existent and they refer to it as no time. The near future is what's about to happen, and that for them they consider to be more of like the present. And then they also believe that time flows backwards. So really, really interesting stuff. I'm not going to go too much further into this because we could probably spend the whole rest of the webinar just exploring that. But again, this is where we see that different cultures think about things like this differently. Okay, so first of our Slido polls coming up here. What I would love to learn from you or to hear from you is what dimensions of cultural diversity do you think about in your workplace? This could be your current workplace, it could be a previous one, or it could just be sort of more generalized. This is anonymous, as all of our polls and questions are. And for anyone who's new to Slido, you can use your device or your phone to grab that QR code, and you'll be able to answer the question through that. If that's not available or the tech's not working, you can go directly to slido.com and use the code 9382779. And if that's still not working for you, because sometimes tech gremlins exist, feel free to go and put your thoughts or your answers in the chat. And if you'd like to stay anonymous, you can always chat me privately and I'll share without sharing your name. All right, I see folks are in here typing, so we'll see what's going to start to come up for people. All right, so we've got cultural and organizational dimensions. Great. And I see people are typing, so we'll see what else comes through. And I feel like I want to say that someone joined in the beginning and said that they were just thinking through generational differences. So that's another example as well. So that's another thing to think through. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Right. I see there's one person who's like really typing a lot. Love it. All right. Friendship. Oh, I love that. Friendship, tenure, work location, educational backgrounds. Yeah, I worked in tech for a large part of my career before starting this journey with Rachel. And in an early job I had at a university, educational background was huge in the workplace. And if you didn't have certain higher ed degrees to your name, you were definitely treated differently, which I learned very quickly. All right, got a lot of more stuff coming through. So let's see what else we have here. Cooperation versus competition, risk tolerance, access, ease. Oh, that's interesting. I'm curious about that one. Rest, cultural beliefs and practices, respect. Wonderful. So we've got lots of different things coming through here. I'll give another like 30 seconds just to give folks a chance to wrap up and share your final thoughts here. So we've got boundaries. I see one more person's typing. Give you 30 seconds more to see what we've got here. Attitudes to mental health. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. These can vary quite dramatically cross-culturally. As I mentioned earlier, I'm biracial. My mom is from India. My dad is of Polish background, and definitely have seen a lot of resistance to things like therapy and just even talking about mental health in some aspects of my family background. So that's a huge one. All right, what else did I see here? Attitudes to work-life balance. Wonderful. So lots of different things that we can be thinking about. Now, I want to do a quick snapshot for our current workplace landscape because we're in 2025 and, it's a unique point in time for us. So here's a couple things in terms of us thinking through all the stuff that you just shared, plus who actually makes up our workforce right now. Now, I do want to name that all this is really primarily US based. So if you're coming in from a different team from, the UK or other places in the world, this might be a little bit different for you, but this is for the US. So right now we've got 5 generations that are present in the workplace. If anyone thinks you can list them all, put it in the chat. But and I'm talking about actively in the workplace. We do see Gen Alpha, which is just kind of coming up, just starting to get into the working world through things like summer jobs, internships, maybe. So if we were to count Gen Alpha, then we'd actually have more like 6 generations, but 5 for now, I think is a safe number to kind of discuss. We've got 74% of Fortune 500 CEOs were white men in 2023, which is the last time we had the data for this. And 37 of the top 50 companies in the Fortune 500 had their CEOs as white men in 2023. There are currently about 7 million LGBTQ plus people who are employed in the private sector. And I want to note that about 4% of the US population identifies in this way, and 34% of the country doesn't have any laws here in the US protecting against workplace harassment or discrimination. 83% of our working population will be a representation of immigrants and their children. And I have another stat on immigrants, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But, we do know that racialized minorities will be the majority really no later than 2050. I will note that given the stat I'm going to share in just a minute, this may change in the future. So this is as of, I really like last year, 2023. 23% roughly, it's about 20, I think the actual stats like a 22.7, 23% roughly of people with disabilities were employed in 2024. And this last stat that I've noted a couple times already is pretty staggering, honestly. So when we're thinking about cultural diversity in the workplace, it's changing really, really quickly. So, what we know is that the number of foreign-born workers in the US labor force has declined by 1.1 million between just January through August of this year. And that's according to a National Foundation for American Policy analysis of the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. The number of foreign-born workers fell by 1.5 million from a peak in March of this year. And so, really, kind of just to tie that all together, what that kind of means is that we should have expected to see about 400,000 more foreign-born workers in the US labor force as of this August, as opposed to what we actually have seen, which is 1.1 million people fewer. That's huge, right? And so, like I said earlier, this 83% number is probably going to change in the future. We're also seeing massive changes in the international talent pipeline here in the US because of various executive orders, policy shifts, the stricter immigration policies, changes in visa rules, like that there's the H-1B change that includes a new $100,000 fee for any new petitions that have been filed after September 21st of this year. Different changes in how people are prioritized, and other different programmatic changes. So again, lots of stuff happening here, but this is trying to just kind of like as of, November 2025, a quick little snapshot as to what the workforce looks like right now. Now, I do want to say that while we are seeing some backslide, I think overall the general trend up to this point has been really undeniably evolving towards greater diversity. What those trends will look like in the future remains to be seen. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about some specific areas of potential cultural differences because the reality is we still have a lot of cultural difference here in the workplace, even with some of these changes that I just talked about. And so, sometimes part of what kind of creates friction in the workplace is the fact that we have differences, and we really need to be aware of what these differences are when we're thinking about how can we better understand and embrace cultural diversity. So here's a couple high-level buckets of difference, and I'm going to drill down into communication a bit further in just a minute. So that's why that's starred. But communication, we see, eye contact. Are you assertive versus non-assertive? Language barriers. We've got teamwork and dynamics. So again, we've named this already, but individualistic cultures versus collectivist cultures, independent sort of approaches versus team-oriented approaches. That one tends to come up a lot in generational differences, because a lot of people were raised or taught to be more independent and problem solve on their own versus other generations that were maybe raised and taught to rely a little bit more on collaboration and community to be successful. So, for example, Gen X and Gen Z are actually both characterized as being more independent, whereas millennials and boomers are a little bit more team oriented, which I think is an interesting sort of split as far as generational differences at work go. Risks and decision making. So in the US, we have a relatively flat management style. But if we want to get things done really quickly, managers are put in place. We have that sort of hierarchy in place to help make snap decisions. If you come from a culture that values traditions and family, then, maybe you might be making decisions in different ways. If you live in countries that have had a long history of war, you might be more willing to accept aggressive behavior from other people because it's been more normalized for your daily life. If we live in societies where people believe that everything is preordained by fate, it's a lot harder to convince people of things that might contradict those beliefs. So that's kind of how we think about things like risk decision making. Feedback is a huge one. So again, we'll talk more about this, but if we have direct versus indirect feedback, positive or negative feedback, formal or informal feedback, giving constructive criticism, being really honest versus praising and being a little bit more harmonious. Um, there's also perceptions of respect and relationships. And I'll talk a lot more about this, but great places to start if you're not sure about lateral versus hierarchical relationships can be the Culture Map by Erin Myers. Amazing resource. I'm definitely going to mention that one again. We've also got a couple more. I'm going to just pop those in the chat. So if anyone's curious, you can take a look at these later. People from indirect cultures tend to use more qualifying words if they're giving negative feedback to sort of soften the tone. So we call these words downgraders. So words like maybe, a little, slightly. And people from direct communication cultures tend to use upgraders, which are words like totally, absolutely, always. And surprise, surprise, the US tends to be a more direct communication culture. And I know I use those words a lot when I talk to others and give feedback. Finally, appearance or dress code, so religious or cultural attire. what we consider to be professional or not. So you'll see, if you see me on the screen right now, I'm wearing my hair curly today. And I do have curly hair naturally, but I was taught and still kind of have a lot of internalized feelings around my hair and what's considered professional. And for many years, especially when I was new to the working force, I would blow dry my hair every day to have straight hair. And even now, still, when I show up in places with straightened hair, I will almost always have somebody say to me, "Oh, your hair looks so amazing or so great." And so there's a lot of this, like, how do we show up and what's considered more professional or not? And again, there's a lot more to go into around hair, especially for Black women in the workplace, which we don't have time for today, but I do want to name that. Okay, so I did mention that we're going to go into communication a little bit further, so let's drill down into that. So one reason that a lot of folks sometimes have challenges with cultural differences at work is because of the fact that communication styles do vary and sometimes vary quite dramatically across cultures. So when we are aware of how these styles can vary, that's really, really helpful in helping us avoid any potential misunderstandings. So things like tone, volume, how quickly we talk, loud, fast, expressive speech tends to be more common in some cultures, but could be considered rude in other cultures. Eye contact. So this can also influence whether or not it is considered polite or rude to make eye contact when you're addressing someone else. And this one's really tricky if we're dealing with virtual and hybrid workplaces, right? For me, as a facilitator, facilitating with you all right now through a screen, I feel like I have to try to mimic eye contact by trying to stare at the camera. But then again, does that actually mean that I'm not engaged if I'm staring somewhere else? Probably not. But how does that show up when we're in these kind of virtual spaces? Also, gaze aversion is a sensory processing tool. And so for some people, not having the direct eye contact is really helpful and sometimes even necessary to manage sensory overwhelm. So, for example, if someone who is autistic is looking away, they very well could be thinking, processing, actually paying quite a deal of attention. But for those of us who aren't aware of that, we might be thinking to ourselves, oh, they're not paying any attention to me at all. Direct eye contact tends to be highly valued in direct communication cultures, like here in the US, but can also be considered really rude, especially in a lot of Asian cultures. Pauses, silences, that can be really uncomfortable for a lot of people who identify with dominant US cultural norms. Some cultures actually value silence and pause because it helps, again, give us time to process information, gather our thoughts. Can also be true for people who identify as neurodivergent. Facial expressiveness. So, this can influence whether low facial expressiveness is considered normal, or is it interpreted as a lack of understanding, interest, or even resistance? Emotional expressiveness also relates to how open we are in talking about our feelings. And it's important to note rather that people from cultures who tend to be more emotionally expressive could still think that it's inappropriate to discuss emotions with people who are not close friends and family. Again, so how are we talking about how we feel? Are we comfortable expressing whether we have different feelings, especially at work? Self-disclosure. So this can be, for example, talking about a difficult personal situation to someone at work. Is that accepted? Is that considered inappropriate? Formality. This could also influence whether personal warmth and respect, or sorry, whether personal warmth or respect and formality are more valued. So again, we see a lot of differences here cross-culturally. Directness, similarly, a lot of Asian cultures and Latin American cultures um, tend to not want to discuss certain things, especially things that are negative or embarrassing directly, but want to be a little bit more subtle about it. Here in the US, the dominant cultural norm is to be relatively direct. Orientation to self or others. So what this means is, are we more oriented to ourselves or are we more oriented to sort of like this collective identity? And this usually shows up in communications styles through whether or not we're using I statements or do we use primarily third person and plural pronouns. Again, here in the US, the dominant culture norm tends to be more individualistic, so more self-oriented. And then finally, cultural context. Culture can influence whether our communication is high or low context. What I mean by this is low context cultures, we see words conveying most of the meaning. And in high context cultures, meaning is conveyed more by subtle, verbal, and even nonverbal cues. If anyone has a guess as to which world cultures are high or low, pop that in the chat and let me know. Um, as you're thinking through that, I will share for the US, the US is the lowest context culture in the world, followed pretty closely by, anyone have a guess? Canada and Australia. High context cultures are cultures like Japan, India, China. And again, this is where you see a lot of the differences I just talked through with those styles really showing up because of whether we're high or low context. We also, again, have to consider neurodivergence and whether we have people who are neurodivergent or neurotypical, because that's also going to play into some of this as well. All right. I mentioned already a resource called The Culture Map by Erin Myers. Amazing resource. Highly recommend it if anyone's not read it. Really, really great to sort of feed into all of this discussion. This activity is from that book. I'm not going to read it through with you, but I'll let you all kind of take a look at it as it's up on the screen. The activity basically is a conversation between two different people in terms of whether or not one of them, in this case, we're naming her Priya, will be available to help work on Saturday. So the question that the book activity poses, which I'll pose to you all as well right now, is do you think that Priya is going to be around to work on Saturday or not? And I think you can see that through this kind of like conversation back and forth, there are different ways of interpreting how we're talking about stuff. And, when I do this activity with groups in a bit more sort of with a bit more time, a lot of times people are like, okay, well, how do I handle this if this comes up? So you can try to get explicit responses. You can set realistic time expectations. You can set communication norms, which can be super helpful, especially if you do have people from different cultures. So coming together and agreeing on what norms you will kind of abide by as a team. You can also make sure that you're building in open-ended questions if you're working with more indirect colleagues. Questions like that tend to be things like, what additional information could I give you? When do you think you could try this new approach? How could I, as your manager, help you? So all those different things kind of play into this. Okay. So we talked about culture, we talked about workplace culture, cultural diversity, some differences. I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit more about awareness, competency, and humility, because I'm going to offer you some ideas, some concepts, and some practices to consider as well. I'm going to share this image here. Now, anyone know what this image relates to? If you've been in some of our webinars or workshops, you've probably seen a variation of this before. This relates to what I like to call the parable of the elephant. And this is a story that's found in many different cultures all around the world. And basically, you have people who are not able to see, they're brought into a space and they are engaging with an elephant. And each of them in turn kind of shares out what it is that they think they're engaging with. So as you can see from the comic here, one person's touching the ear and they're like, oh, it's a big fan or a sail. One person's touching the trunk and they're like, oh, this is a snake, so on and so forth. I love to use and bring up this idea and this story when I talk about culture because it relates to cultural differences by showing that each culture, just like each of these figures in this comic, perceives just a piece of a larger, more complex reality that we all are living in. And so our cultural experiences, our cultural biases can lead to different viewpoints. And if we don't have an understanding that, for example, my culture and my background and my upbringing gives me, sort of feeds into my lens, my viewpoint, but each of you on this call has a slightly different and maybe sometimes a very different upbringing, background, different cultural sort of norms and differences that we've just talked through that's going to lead you to have a different viewpoint, a different interpretation. And so we have to be thinking about this in the sense of what is the difference, because we each might be looking at a situation or experiencing a situation and have maybe really different interpretations of it. And it doesn't mean that I'm right and someone else is wrong or that they're right and I'm wrong. It just means that there can be multiple truths at the same time. All right, so I want to talk a bit about cultural awareness, humility, and competency, and we'll start with awareness. This is the ability to recognize, acknowledge the existence of different cultures, just like we talked about with the elephant story right now, and really be open to learning about them. Cultural competency is around how can we use our knowledge and our understanding of different cultures to be able to then take that next step further and interact effectively and respectfully within various different cultural settings. So this goes beyond just recognition to actually kind of like practice. And cultural humility is an ongoing process of self-reflection and learning about not just other cultures, but our own culture too, because we can never fully understand another culture. And I would actually kind of hazard a guess that we could never really fully understand our culture either. We're always learning. And cultural humility was actually coined by healthcare professionals to start off with. And this is kind of the space that I think about when I think about that statement that I mentioned earlier, which is this is the marathon, and the marathon is never ending. The work is always ongoing. The journey is never done. One of my favorite folks in this space is Gerald Wing Sue, and as he shares in his quote, cultural competence is more than just cognitive and intellectual understanding. It must be obtained through experiential reality. So again, using a culturally humble lens allows us to be more curious when we're interacting with folks, especially in a workplace setting. So I have a couple different tools and action items that you can start thinking about using or taking some actions, and then we'll go and start to shift into some Q&A. So if you do have questions, start thinking about those, and we'll have some time for that at the end. All right, first tool. I'm not going to talk through this because I use this tool so many times in all of my webinars. If this is a new tool for you, let us know in chat and we'll be happy to share some additional information afterwards. But really briefly, a working with me document is a way to share all the things that make you you and how you work best in whatever environment you're working in. And it's something that we really encourage everyone and every team to do and share around with their team and update it and review it on a regular basis. Really helpful. Building on a working with me document, we could think about taking a next step, which is a self and collective assessment. So this kind of builds on that document that I just mentioned. So these are questions that are a bit less like, okay, I like to get up in the morning. For example, Rachel is a really early riser. I am not. That's definitely included in our working with me documents, but this kind of goes a little bit higher, a little bit broader. So these are questions like how might hierarchy within our company impact the relationships and dynamics? How might my social identities impact the way that I perceive myself or how others perceive me? Do I have assumptions about people, about cultures, about backgrounds, behaviors that impacts how I show up, how I work with others, how I'm relating to other people? How do I think and work, and how does that influence the roles and relationships that I have at work? So these are really helpful processing questions that, especially if you're working in an environment with different folks from all different backgrounds, could be helpful for you to just think through or even discuss in collaboration with your other team members. All right, I mentioned the culture map. So this is just a couple of snippets from the culture map. Again, it's a great resource. I cannot emphasize that enough. Erin Meyer is a professor and she's also an author. And so this is just an example of some of the frameworks that she uses and brings forward. And her sort of claim is that we can improve our relationships by considering where we, as well as the different folks from different countries, fall on these 8 key dimensions of cultural difference, as she has named them, that impact communication and collaboration, especially if you're in a managerial role. So this is helpful for anybody, but especially for folks who are kind of thinking through this as a leader or a manager. So these 8 dimensions are communication, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling, which is that time aspect. Now, this is a lot, I know. I'm not going to talk through all of it, but this is just an example of how you use that framework. And so all these little bubbles as you can see, relate to different countries. And so for each of the dimensions, the idea is that you basically plot out where the different countries are in each of these dimensions. And then that helps you kind of start to think through how are you using this to map back to your own unique team, your workplace, your company, your industry. And so this can be really helpful if you are especially working on teams that have people from a lot of different countries. This is what the US culture map looks like. If anyone's curious, is where the US tends to fall on this map. And so, as we've already kind of talked through, we're very low context. We're about the middle when it comes to evaluating. We are on the high end here of persuading. In terms of leading, we tend to be a little bit in the middle, maybe a little bit more towards egalitarian, because as I mentioned earlier, we tend to be a bit more flat when it comes to hierarchies in the workplace. And you can see how the rest of these things plot out here as well. A couple of final tips to just wrap us up here. These are just things that I always like to emphasize and encourage with folks is just again, like be familiar, be aware of like yourself, what you have as far as like your own biases, any stories or narratives that you know that you have in your mind. What are your own cultural practices? How does this show up for you? Ask questions, use that lens of curiosity. Think about, okay, I like to work in this way, but maybe we can consider different ways of working together or communicating together. Maybe a style of feedback that works really well for me doesn't work so well for other people on my team. So, can I adjust that? How does that feel? As always, avoid stereotypes. We don't want to go down that rabbit hole. It can be helpful to have patterns and things like the culture map tool in the book tend to really sort of group countries and folks from different cultures into big buckets like I've just talked through. But again, like everyone is an individual. So you may not, I should say, you don't want to just automatically put people into categories based off of a lot of the things that we've just talked about. And that kind of leads me to my next point, which is got to get to know who you're working with. So really try to make sure that you understand who your teammates are, how they're showing up, what their styles are, talking through all that or learning about them. And also feedback styles. It's really helpful. There's not just one way to give feedback or receive feedback. And so if you know a variety, it'll be really helpful for you when you're communicating and especially as managers, making sure that you're supporting your team equally and not defaulting to folks who tend to gravitate more towards your preferred feedback style versus others. One final note before we get into the Q&A is cultural appreciation versus appropriation. I could probably spend a whole hour just on this topic too, but I don't have that time because, unfortunately, we are limited by our social construct of time today. But it's a really important note, and I couldn't let us go to Q&A without mentioning this too. So sometimes when we are leaning into cultural awareness, we get stuck and caught up in the dilemma of cultural appreciation or cultural appropriation. So, what are the differences here? Cultural appreciation is when you're looking to understand another culture, you want to learn about it, you want to widen your perspective, you want to connect with other people cross-culturally. Cultural appropriation is when you take one aspect of a culture that's not your own and you use it for your own personal interest. So, this looks like adopting different elements from different cultures by members of another culture. Oftentimes, what ends up happening is the original meaning or importance is kind of thrown out the window. And a lot of times we see there's an element of financial gain here. So I don't know if anyone watches Shark Tank, but there was a pretty not like famous, but there was a pretty memorable scene that happened, I think this year, where the actor Simu Liu had kind of called out a boba tea startup that was run by two white people. And he raised this exact question. He was like, isn't this kind of cultural appropriation of boba tea? And so again, a lot of times what we see is there's this element of taking something from a minority culture or an oppressed culture and repackaging it, redoing it, sanitizing it in a way that leads to profit or credit for the dominant group, while not acknowledging the origins of Do not get me started on yoga. That is a whole other discussion for another time. A lot of characteristics of cultural appropriation are things like adopting an element or like a cultural item out of context. So, for example, saging, religious symbols, a First Nations headdress, not a costume. It's a cultural element. Perpetuating stereotypes is another characteristic. So, kind of reducing a cultural element to a really simplistic caricature. The profit and credit, the financial gain aspect I already talked about, taking things without permission. So that could be artifacts, knowledge, or even intellectual property without consent. And so people are always like, okay, well, how do I not do this? Because I don't want to appropriate, but I do want to appreciate. So, research is a great first step. Learn about the history and meaning behind cultural elements before you use it. Try to avoid sacred items. So, recognize that some items are sacred and should not be used by outsiders. Give credit and share the benefits. So, if you're inspired by other cultures, that's amazing. And a lot of times, people are like, I want you to buy my jewelry or my art or this or that, but buy it from someone who's part of that culture. Credit the source. Make sure that the community, that cultural community is benefiting, not folks who are just taking without being part of that culture. And engage. So talk to people from the culture to better understand what the practices are, why they're significant. So again, really quick snippet. We could talk a lot more about that. We just don't have enough time for today. But if you want to learn more, definitely let us know. We can talk more in the future if that's of interest to you.